In this video, we're going to implement server-side pagination in NextJS's app router. We're going to build this movie app together where we're fetching some movies from our MongoDB database. I'm going to jump in the code and show you how we're connecting and fetching this data. But the idea is to implement this pagination buttons where we can just jump into the next page or the next batch of movies and fetch the next round of movies, or go back, fetching different pages or different limits of number of documents we want to page from our MongoDB database. Now, typically inside of a React application or a Next.js app in the pages router, you would do this inside a client component where you would hold a state for the current page, and then you would change that state in response to client interactions of hitting these buttons. And whenever that state changes, you refetch from your database, from your API endpoints, and then re-render the components here. Now, in this video, we want to stay on the server side. We want to still fetch data on the server side, and we're going to see how we would go about implementing pagination while we're fetching data on the server side. So let's jump into the code and see what we did over here. I've started with a brand new Next.js app. It's using TypeScript and Tailwind CSS. Let's just jump right into the root layout. This is what you get out of the box when you install the script. The only thing that I have added is this header component where it gives me these navigation links so I can go to the home page or to the movies page. And I'm using the next link component to do a client-side transition or navigation. Now, inside my homepage, I just deleted the boilerplate code and just replaced it with the content of the homepage. So there's not much going on there. And this is where we're actually connecting to our MongoDB and fetching some movies. So inside our movie folders where we are rendering our movies, I have this page.tsx, which is responsible, or it's the component responsible for actually rendering this page. I did also put a loading UI. I've discussed this in the previous video on the channel, actually last week, where I talked about loading UI and suspense in Next.js and how you can easily add a loading UI skeleton or spinner to your route segments. If you haven't watched that video, I'm going to link it in the cart so you can watch that video as well. But nonetheless, this is just to show a loading UI while we're actually fetching data. And we're going to focus on this page. Ignore this trigger for now. I'm going to come back to it at the end. And we're going to actually build on top of this video next week. But for now, let's just jump into the page and see what we're doing here. So from a high level, as you can see here, I am fetching some movies by calling this function get movies. I'm going to get into these options or parameters I'm passing into in a second, but let's just see what this get movies function is all about. So I have created this lib folder where I have this Mongo folder. Inside of it there is a client and there is this movies file. Let's just start with the client. This is where we're creating a MongoDB client or a Mongo client. We're connecting to our instance and then sharing this client throughout our modules or our app. So any file that wants to talk to the database is going to use the same client instead of recreating this client. Now let's see what we're doing inside this client file. We're getting the Mongo client from MongoDB. We are reading our MongoDB URI. So you have to create a .env.local file and paste in your connection string to your MongoDB cluster. If you don't know how to use MongoDB or you're new to that, I do have a video on the channel where I talk about MongoDB and how you can kind of connect to your MongoDB instance from your Next.js app. I'm going to also link that in the card. But assuming that you know how to create an instance of a cluster for MongoDB in MongoDB Atlas, which is the hosted version for MongoDB, you're going to paste in your connection string here. And all we're doing here really is to create a new MongoDB client with our connection string, passing it some options, and then sharing this Mongo client or this client promise throughout our app. We're also setting some global variables for when we are in development mode, so that we're not recreating this client promise because of the hot module reload. This is actually a code snippet I got from the Vercel team. So if you go to NextJs, you can go to different templates. If you actually search here for MongoDB, you're going to see this MongoDB starter. You can just go to the repo. This is also a TypeScript application, and inside of the lib folder, you can see this MongoDB is the same kind of way of connecting to our database. So definitely check this repo out as a reference if you're using MongoDB. Now back inside of our application, the other file that I have inside of my lib is this movies, where I am putting all my movie related functions or database access functions. So all I'm doing up top is having this init function, which is going to initialize a connection to my database and get a handle for my collections. Here I'm getting a handle to my database. You can pass in a database here as a string, or you can pass the database name inside of your connection string, and then you're going to get a handle to your database, and then from there I'm calling this collection where I'm getting a handle to my movies collection. And I have one function here that kind of works with my movies collection, and that's called get movies. This is the same function that I'm calling from my page component that's going to return to me some movies. Now let's see what we're doing here. Again, ignore the page and limit for a second. All we're doing is to see if we have the handle to our movies collection. If we do, we're just performing a find query on our collection, and I'm transforming it into an array and returning an object with the movies array. Now inside of our page component, what we're doing here is to get this movies array and map over it, and for each one show an image, a title, and some details about the movie. So let's go back to our application. So this is what we're doing. It's a grid that we're just showing this list items. Now let's see how we go about implementing the pagination part of it. Now going back to our get movies function, typically when you're querying your database, in this case MongoDB, you would have functions or filters or parameters that you can pass into your query that limits the number of responses you get or skips a specific number of records, or in this case documents, in your collection. Now in MongoDB we have this limit function which you can call it on your cursor. So the result of this find query is going to return to you a cursor. You can call the limit on it, and then or skip to skip a specific number of pages or documents, I'm sorry. Now the limit is pretty self-explanatory. It's the amount of documents or records that we want to return in each query. Now, how do we go about getting this skip? How many number of documents should we skip so that we can have different pages? Now here, if you look at this variable that I've created here, imagine that we are fetching 10 movies every time. When we're on the first page, or we want to get the first page or the first 10 movies, we are on the first page and the limit is 10. And we're basically skipping no documents. So we have this formula to get how many number of documents or movies we want to skip. So it's page minus 1 times the limit. So if I'm on the first page, 1 minus 1 is 0, and then I'm skipping 0 images. So I'm only getting the first 10 movies. Now, when I pass in page 2, meaning that I want to get the next 10 movies, or the second batch of movies, which is also limited to 10. So what we're doing here is to get the page second minus 1. That's 1 times 10. It's 10. So we're skipping the first 10 and also limiting to 10. So we're getting 10 movies. So this is a way to implement pagination, and almost any database has these two functions in one shape or another to limit the number of results you're getting or skip a specific amount of documents. Now, this function requires you to pass in a page or limit if you want to change the number of documents or movies that you're getting back, or the specific page that you want it to be. It defaults to page number 1 and limit to 10, so it returns 10 movies, and always defaults to the first page or the first 10 movies if you don't pass anything to it. Now going back to our page component, let's actually see how we can pass this page and limit to the get movies function from inside of our page component. Now, if you've built any traditional server rendered app before React or Next.js, you might be familiar with passing in pages and limits as query strings. And that's the exact same pattern that we're using here because we want to implement pagination server side. So I'm passing in, if you can see up there, a page number 2 up there, or a different page parameter as a query string to my URL. Now you get access to this search parameters object from inside your React server components or page components, where you would have an object with keys, which are a string, corresponding to the keys that we have as a query string. And then the values, as you might know, it's either a string or an array of string if there is multiple of the same parameter, or it may be undefined without any value. You get access to this search parameters, so Next.js sends this object to your page component, so we can get our page by reading this search parameters. Now I'm checking to see if this is of type string because it can be an array or it can be undefined. If it is of type string, I want to turn it into a number because that's what our database query requires. And if there isn't anything, I'm just going to default to 1, so I'm on the first page if there's no page passed. I'm also reading the limit, so you can optionally pass in a limit, which is, again, if it is a string, we're turning it into a number. And if this doesn't exist, I'm just going to default to 10. Okay. And I'm passing the same parameters down into my get movies function, which is going to call this function we just saw together and passing this page and limit to our query by creating this limit and skip methods. So for example, here, if I come up top there and hit page 4, this is going to get me the 4th page of our query. I can also include a limit. So if I pass in a limit and say I want my limit to be 20 instead of 10, I'm going to get 20 movies, and I'm going to skip the first 3 pages, which is the 3 pages of 20 movies. I'm going to skip the first 60 movies. I'm going to get the 4th one. Okay, so this is how we're implementing pagination server side. Now let's quickly look at these 2 buttons. You might be wondering what these 2 are doing. Now these 2 buttons are these 2 pagination buttons I have here, and they're just literally links pointing to different pages. So for example, for our next, let's start from this next button, which is just a link that goes to movies and then passes this page parameter and then receives this page. This is the current page that we are on, and just adds 1 to it. So therefore this takes us to the next page. Now this is just a local variable we created here by reading our search parameter. So you don't require to have any state. You're basically using the URL as a state. If you're persisting whatever page we are on in the URL, we can read through it. We can then send the user to the next page, which then triggers another request to the server to fetch the next batch of our movies. And we're doing something similar for the previous button where we're just subtracting 1 from the page. I just put some checks over here. So if we are on the first page, for example, when we go to the movies, I'm disabling this button because we can't go back. We don't want to go to page 0 or to page negative. So I'm checking to see if only page is more than 1, I'm actually allowing them to push and to go to the previous page. Otherwise, I'm just going to default to the first page. Now you can implement a similar pattern for the next one. So you can get the total number of movies that you have, and then you can calculate the total number of pages that you have, the current pages. You can just expand on the functionality here by also disabling the next button where there is no movies left to fetch, so they're not indefinitely just hitting this endpoint or querying your database. But for now, we just implemented this previous button or disabled this previous button if there's nothing else or they're on the first page. A couple of things I want to mention here. Now, this pattern of persisting these values in the URL when you're communicating to the server is actually a common pattern in traditional server render apps. And we're kind of going back to that pattern because now we are fetching data on the server side in React Server Components in the app router. And we're going to use this same concept for things like search filters. So a lot of folks have asked me, how would you go about implementing different filters if you wanted to search your database, for example, here. So I'm going to have a video coming up next week, so stay tuned for that. But in that, I'm also using this same concept. In a traditional React app or in NextJs 12 in Pages router, where you would just implement this search functionality in client side, you would hold a state for different filters. And then once this state changes, you're refetching the data from client side. Now you can still do that in the app router. You can still use client side component, but you can also use the URL as a state to persist these values or different filters that you want to fetch server side without having to actually use client side components. So we're going to implement that in the next video, where we're going to search movies by title, and maybe we even add more filters like filtering movies based on their cast or based on the year that they were published. Coming back to our example here, this is your typical pagination buttons. You can expand this, as I explained, to have more buttons. You can read the total number of pages. You can implement a functionality for the user to jump into the last page or to the first page instead of just having to loop through them one by one. But it's going to be the same concept as I have shown here. Now, the other way that you can do pagination is the infinite scroll. So instead of the user pushing in buttons, the idea is that when they get to the bottom of the list, you're going to load more. And it's like infinitely loading more movies in this case. Now, there are different ways to implement this, and I'm going to have a specific video for infinite scrolling server side or in React Server Components. But just to show you a little teaser for what we're going to be implementing, I've created this trigger div or component, which is going to use intersection observer. This is a little div that you can put in at the end of our list over here maybe. And I'm going to pass into it this same limit that we are reading from our page. So I'm going to save this. And if I go to my movies, if I just scroll down, this is going to load more movies as the user is just going down the list. So it's kind of implementing this infinite scroll, but it's all happening on the server side. Now, there are different ways you can do this. You can attach your intersection observer to the last movie on the list and then detach it anytime that you're adding movies and then attach it to the last movie again, or have this little div at the end of your list as I'm having it here. And anytime this div comes into the viewport using the intersection observer, we're actually using the router. This is coming from the use router hook from Next Navigation to just push a different URL or change the URL. And this time, instead of changing the page, I'm just changing the limits, because in the infinite scroll, you're always on the first page and you're just getting more movies. Now, again, there are different ways to implement this. This may not be the best way, because as you're increasing or as you're going down these pages, you're actually increasing the limit of documents that you're returning. So for example, here I'm returning 50. So as this increases, you're just refetching this whole 100 ones. You can maybe sprinkle in some client components whereby you would just fetch the first batch on the server side. And then from that point on, when they're scrolling, you can just fetch the rest of them client side. So you don't have to refetch the whole 100 documents. You just fetch 10 movies at a time and just hold a state, hold an array, or maybe a global context for your movies. on the client side, where you would just fetch 10 and add 10 to the end of that list that you already have. So different ways to do it, but just to show you that this is even possible with still fetching data on the server side, just having this trigger component inside this trigger component, because I'm using the intersection observer and the use router, I turned it into use client. So inside of our app, this is the only thing that's a client component, the rest is server component, but you get the idea. You can either use this pagination, which is going to loop through different pages, passing in a page, which is just using a link to change the URL search parameters that we had up top there, or implementing this trigger function if you don't have that many documents or that many records to return from your database. Maybe you want to implement this, but we're going to dive deeper into implementing infinite scroll in a separate video, so stay tuned for that, where we would actually show different ways that you can implement it, fetching data on the server side or sprinkling in some client-side component. That's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented server-side pagination in NextJs 13 app router. In the next videos, we're going to build on top of this app by adding the infinite scroll functionality and also the search and search filters, where users can maybe search movies by title or filter them based on different criteria. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you're interested in learning NextJs 13, I do have a course. There's a link in the description. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.